Hello everyone, this is Gene. I'm back with another video. So I came across this particular tweet by a Twitter user named HeroGeek. Right, HeroGeek wants to help people tell their stories. And the tweet says this. It's part of a thread, but I just want to focus on this tweet in particular because it brought a thought to mind, and I sort of want to explore that thought. And so it says this. Right, I've had two people ask me if there will be any LGBTQ representation in Paragon Prime, which is, I guess, an indie comic that they're working on. My answer is a resounding no. Right now, every mainstream comic book publisher caters to them. There is no shortage of gay rep out there, and they continue about how, for example, there is a lack, in their opinion, of Christian characters, positive Christian representation, and how characters like, say, Nightcrawler, right, have been written to lose their faith or act against their faith recently. Now, that's not really the part that I want to address. What I want to address is this. Now, look, I'm not. How do I put it? I guess the best way I can put it is that I could never imagine myself asking a creator of anything, a song, a band, a comic, a TV show, my food. I cannot imagine asking a creator about representation of any kind. And that's the thing that sort of struck me, that came to mind when I read this tweet. I could not imagine myself as one of those two people asking HeroGeek or asking anybody if there's going to be any sort of demographic representation, right? I personally am largely indifferent when it comes to representation in a work. It's not something I look for, it's not something that I demand, right? Personally. What I care first and foremost about is whether the story is good, if it's interesting, and if the characters are interesting characters, right? For me, demographic stuff like age or gender or sexuality and all that other stuff are largely secondary, and I view them as more elements that perhaps inform the character or give the character some flavor or personality when used within reason. But it's never been something that has been a make or break for me when it comes to like a purchasing decision, right? Am I going to spend money on this? Am I going to spend time on this? And I think that's what struck me about this, because it's like I've never cared about representation in the work, and I grew up and I came of age in the 1990s and the 2000s. So I grew up with very diverse media, right? But I never went into that media with this, very critical eye that is just so prominent today, right? Like, I find myself thinking, like, what if I was like 7? It's like 1992. I'm 7 again, right? And my mother is looking at Street Fighter 2, right? And she's concerned not about the violence in the game, right? A bit intense, a teen game, a teen rated game for like a 7-year-old kid, right? But I can't imagine her or anyone like looking at the game, right, as it was at the time and thinking, well, there's too much Asian rep here. We have some Americans, that's good. But there's only two brown skinned people. One of them this Indian stretchy guy. And then we have the black boxer who's the bad guy because of course he is, right? No, my daughter can't play this game. Not enough black representation. And you only have one woman, and she's not American and she's not black. Right? Like, imagine the awesomeness I would have missed out on if my mother had been of that mindset. Fortunately, she was not. She has never much cared about the type of video games her children play outside of, do the kids like it? and does it keep them out of my hair? Right? That was sort of her approach to things. But I just imagine all of the things that I would have missed out on, or my brother would have missed out on, if we had been taught, whether it be by our mother or by society at large at that time, right? To have this overly critical eye looking at every piece of media and seeing if it has enough of this demographic group or that demographic group. Like, so many TV shows that or cartoons that were popular back in the day probably wouldn't make it today if these type of views had existed in force back then, because they would have never passed this metric. Like, how there's this idea of the Bechdel test for movies, right? That supposedly is supposed to ascertain, or figure out how many times female characters talk about men, right? In a film, right? Well, imagine if such a thing existed, and maybe it does. I don't know, but imagine if such a thing existed in media as regards like gender or orientation or race or whatever. Most of the stuff that I grew up with wouldn't have passed it because, for example, right, with gender, right, a lot of shows, especially team shows back in the day, or video games, in particular fighting games, had like one female character, right? That was sort of the progressive thing to do back then, was to feature one female character, right? Like in beat 'em up games, you had like Blaze from Streets of Rage, or you had Tyrus Flair from Golden Axe, or of course, you had Chun Li, right? The first lady of fighting games in Street Fighter Two, I should say, because she wasn't even in the first game, right? But or the very first Mortal Kombat game, right? Sonya is the only woman, and Sonya was a last minute addition, right? So I just imagine what things would have been like, and how much I, as a gamer, or just as a kid, would have missed out on entertainment wise if we'd had such a critical eye. Like, that's not enough women. How can you have 7 characters in a video game and only have one of them be a woman? Be like, cause that's the last slot. It's either that or nothing, honey. And of course, they would follow up with 2 more women like 2 years later with the release of Mortal Kombat 2. Right? But think about it. Imagine if the first Mortal Kombat game, right, got all of the press it got, and all of the negative attention and all of the controversy that it got back then. Not because of the graphic blood and violence, right? But because it didn't feature a black character and it only had one woman out of 7 characters, right? Like, I, it's honestly something that I really cannot imagine. It's like, imagine if that's what people were upset about when the first Mortal Kombat game came out. Not the blood, not the violence, not the fatalities, but not enough representation. Like, imagine if people like were upset over cartoons like Biker Mice from Mars, which was about literally that. Giant humanoid mice on motorcycles from Mars. So absurd, it was awesome. And caring about like the color of the fur on on the mice, and if it relates to real life, right? Is that brown furred mouse a stand-in for brown people? Is that black furred mouse a stand-in for African Americans? Like, I can't imagine that type of mindset. I can't imagine going into something basically looking for a reason to be upset. And people say I do that all the time with these videos, but it's like, honestly, I cannot imagine being that critical when all you want to be supposedly is entertained. And yet, as this tweet sort of proves, there are some people, at least 2 individuals according to this tweet, who do look at media that way, who look at a work and instead of asking questions like, what's the theme of the story, what's the setting, uh, who are the characters, are the characters cool, are they interesting, right? What are their powers, things like that. The question is, will there be representation of this group or that group? Like, you're missing the point. If you're asking that type of question when there's no need to ask that question, then you're missing the point. Entertainment, from my opinion, entertainment by and large should not be about necessarily representation of certain groups, because the thing is that you're always going to have overrepresentation and underrepresentation. Basketball, for example, large overrepresentation of African Americans, underrepresentation of everyone else. And you know how it's underrepresentation of everyone else? Jeremy Lin got attention because of his race. The idea of a Chinese basketball player was that attention grabbing when it shouldn't have been, right? He's been very open about that side of his fame and how he was received and how he was treated in the NBA and all of that, right? But like, imagine watching a basketball game, looking at that type of stuff. Like, do we have enough Asians on the team? Are there enough Hispanics? Right? It's just a foreign concept to me. But there are people like that apparently. But the thing is that when it comes to diversity or representation, and take it from somebody who actually does have to track uh, demographic data as part of my job in real life, there's no such thing as balance, right? It's not a pizza, right? You know how if you cut a pizza, you can get 8 perfectly sized slices and everybody gets the exact same size? True diversity or true representation does not work like that. It is not a pizza. Not everybody gets the same slice of the pie, right? Depending on the position, depending on the job, depending on a bunch of things, Lo- location, the labor market, a bunch of things. There will be overrepresentation of certain groups, and there will be underrepresentation of other groups. This imbalance, right, is not immediately indicative of discrimination or intentionally keeping people out, right? It's evidence of just life, right? Just life. For example, right, people have noted that there is a lack of women in jobs like, say, construction work, right, or basically any sort of physical labor type work, right? I don't see that changing anytime soon. Not because people are intentionally trying to keep the women's out, but just because it's a type of job a lot of women just don't apply to. Now, I think that the ones who do apply, so long as they can, do the job as well as anyone else, fine. But just because there's an underrepresentation of women in a construction job doesn't mean that they're being discriminated against. It just means that not a lot of women are in this line of work, right? But that was sort of a side point. But my main point in all of this is that I think that when it comes to media, we need to start asking the important questions again, right? And the important question to me is not, will there be any LGBTQ representation, or will there be any straight representation, or will there be any female representation, or white representation, or black, or Christian, or non Christian, or anything else. Those are not the questions we should be asking, at least not at the very beginning of a work, right? The questions we should be asking are, why should I buy this? Why should I put money down for this? Right? What makes your work cool? What makes your work stand out? Right? Again, what's your story? What's your plot? Are the characters cool? Are they interesting? Those are the questions we should be asking creators, right? We shouldn't be asking them about group representation. We should be asking about we should be asking them to explain and to represent their creative ideas for this story, for this world that they are trying to create for our entertainment. Now, if it happens to have LGBTQ representation, if a creator is working on something and it makes sense for the work to have LGBTQ representation, I'm fine with it. For example, there was LGBTQ rep in Mass Effect. One of my favorite characters is Samara. She's effectively a lesbian. I have no problem with it. You know why? Because it made sense for the character. And her story wasn't even really surrounding her orientation. It was more about her relationship with her daughter and the tragedy that was, right? And holding to an honor code and the responsibility of a parent and things like that, right? But I loved Mass Effect, and that had LGBTQ rep, and it had female rep, and all the other stuff. It's fine by me, just so long as it makes sense in the work, right? And I would hold that for anything. So to Hero Geek, I like I said, it's like I don't know anything about this work. So if anything, it's like tell me why I should be interested. Is basically it. But I wish them the best, and yeah, that's it. The only questions I have are what, who are the characters, what's the story? That's what I want to know. Who are the characters? What's the story? Why should I be interested in this? Everything else to me is a long, long, long second. But anyhow, that's the end of my ramble that went everywhere and nowhere at the same time as my rambles tend to do. But anyway, please let me know what you think, and I will see you all in the next one, or hear you all in the next one. Have a good day or night wherever you are. Bye.